Welcome to PodcastRx, a production of Diamond Pharmacy Services. This is a show about pharmacy, but don't let the title fool you. While we definitely talk with pharmacists about medication topics, we also sit down with nurses, technicians, and other pros to discuss relevant issues in corrections health, long-term care, and so much more. Whether you're a pharmacist, a practitioner, or just find these things fascinating, this is a show for you. On this episode,
a vaccine is basically like a pathogen imposter, okay? So it may look like a bacteria or virus, but it doesn't make the body actually sick.
Vaccines. They're one of the greatest success stories in all of medical history. As the World Health Organization points out, there are now vaccines to protect us from over 20 potentially deadly diseases. Vaccination saves 2 to 3 million lives each year from diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, influenza, measles, and that's just a few. And now as the world comes to grips with a historic pandemic, the anticipation to add Covid-19 to that list of diseases is certainly top of mind for the medical community. On this episode, we welcome back Chris Bender, PharmD. As a pharmacist with Diamond's Drug Information Center, Chris provides consultation and educational services to correctional facilities and the occasional long-term care facility. We talk about the history of vaccines, how they're developed, what they do and what they don't do, and their impact on Chris's everyday practice as a pharmacist. And of course, we also discuss the ongoing development of a COVID-19 vaccine and what the future may or may not hold. We cover a lot of ground in this episode, and we hope you enjoy the discussion. I'm Adam Campbell, and this is PodcastRx. All right, welcome to PodcastRx. I'm on here with Chris Bender, PharmD. As you know, Chris has been on the show 3 or 4 times. Welcome back, Chris.
Hey, thanks for having me, Adam. Yeah, it's been a few times, so I'm finally starting to get like my podcast legs under me. So I'm just happy to be back with you guys today.
Well, we're happy to have you. And of course, we're a relatively young show. We're just a little over 10 episodes. So you're also helping us. Great guests like you help us get our podcast legs as hosts, developing content. So we really appreciate you being on with us. Of course, we love having you on because you're an affable guy. You're easy to talk to, but we also love the authoritative command you have over pretty much any discussion topic. Really, you like to nerd out. So, and we were talking with you, pitching ideas, and one thing that you brought up was vaccines. And of course, that's like a no-brainer. It's like, of course, we need to talk vaccines. We're in the midst of a global pandemic. Everybody's waiting very patiently for a vaccine. So, of course, that makes all the sense in the world to talk to, not just about COVID, which we'll get into later, but also just on an everyday level with your work in the Drug Information Center, with corrections, with long-term care. But before we even get into any of that, I thought it would be cool to just get a broad view of vaccines. Really, let's talk history of vaccines, because this is a really fascinating history, and I'd love to get that from a pharmacist's point of view. So where did vaccines really begin?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's like a fantastic question. And obviously to understand vaccines, it's important to understand like where they came from. So I think anybody, I know I'm a big fan of trivia and stuff like that. And I know a lot of people out there are too, I'm sure. So, anybody who's interested in a bit of history of trivia would probably be quick to jump to the name like, oh, Edward Jenner is kind of like the pioneer of vaccines. That's where it started. Nothing before that, right?
Right. That's the name I always went to was Edward Jenner. Yeah.
Exactly. And of course he's the big guy, but while he's certainly vital to the development overall of vaccination and probably bringing it to, the forefront, to the worldwide forefront, he's actually not the first person or culture or civilization to experiment with the concept of vaccination. So believe it or not, the earliest evidence of vaccination is from around the year 1000 CE, in which people were experimenting with smallpox vaccination. This was mainly throughout China, but it was also occurring in Africa and Turkey as well. But what I thought was even more interesting, what was more interesting is that there's even been some suggestion, although less proven, that these practices have been occurring even as far back as like the year 200 BCE.
Wow.
So yeah, and I mean that kind of blew me away in terms of like how old the process is. And I think it just lends a little light to like how much insight people had in eras that we typically don't think of the traditional scientific method being available.
Yeah, exactly. Like when you say that, I think like what observational data in particular was leading to you, yeah, let me say that again. What
Yeah,
observational data in particular is leading you to believe that, to think, oh, we'll use the infection to fight the infection.
absolutely. And I think what's crazy about it is this kind of and to kind of to delve into how they were doing it. To say up front, I don't think I would have thought to do this, but what they were doing was back in those times, the process was essentially they would grind up, and pardon anybody with a weak stomach, but they were grinding up some of the smallpox scabs, and then they would blow that dust into the nostril of an uninfected person. Or
Wow.
right, and to do that, to have the thought process to do that just seems kind of abstract and kind of out of the box thinking. What's even kind of a little bit grosser was that they would sometimes also take, the matter from from an actual smallpox sore, some of the fluid in there, and they would scratch it into the skin of an uninfected person. So that's kind of how the origins of vaccines kind of came to be. They actually did that process for many centuries to come. Like that was the way that vaccines were done for so long after that. And while that was great, obviously that was like a modern miracle for the time, I'm sure, putting myself in that position. The problem with this process was that the people who were receiving the quote unquote vaccination would actually go on to develop symptoms of smallpox. So they would have fever, rash, because you were essentially kind of giving them a form of the disease.
Mm-hmm.
But the main benefit of this was that by doing that, people would, yes, they would get those symptoms, but fewer people actually died from this process than if they had received smallpox in a natural fashion. So I guess if you're weighing pros and cons, doing this process was far more beneficial due to the reduction in death.
For sure.
So let's fast forward a bit. Obviously, a lot of time has gone by between the year 200 BCE or even 1000 CE. We fast forward to 1796, and that's in comes Edward Jenner. So the guy everyone thinks about. And what's interesting about him is he noticed that there were dairy maids would sometimes be getting these lesions on their hands, from milking the cows. And it turns out these lesions on the women's hands were from a virus called the cowpox virus. And as the name probably suggests, cowpox is in the same family of viruses as smallpox. But the cool thing, or not necessarily the cool thing, but the good thing about cowpox is that it produces a much more mild, much less lethal disease. What was good about cowpox was he also noticed that those dairy maids who had a history of cowpox lesions, they didn't develop symptoms after they were exposed to smallpox. So this was sort of his aha moment,
Wow.
And he said, maybe if I give someone cowpox, I can then protect them from getting smallpox in the future. And like a true revolutionary, that's exactly what he did. So he took an 8-year-old boy, and he exposed him to matter from a cowpox sore from a hand of a dairy maid. So it's essentially the same process they were doing, 1,000 years ago. The boy, they reported that he got a little bit, feverish, didn't feel so well for about a week or so, but then he recovered. And he got over that. What was the ultimate bold move then was that Jenner went on to expose the child to the real deal, exposed him to smallpox. And fortunately for the child and Jenner, the child remained healthy.
Yeah,
And then
that's just sorry, it's just incredible. The smallpox, of course, one of history's most feared and absolutely deadly and disfiguring diseases. And to say that's a bold move is quite the understatement.
Exactly. So that's why I say, fortunately for all parties involved, just the foresight to be able to do that and feel safe enough to do that process was amazing. Of course, we've come a long way since then. I mean, it would still be nearly a full century later until we saw our next vaccine development, which is kind of surprising, but it took until 1885 for us to develop the rabies vaccine. But then we really saw a boom in the 1930s when we started to see antitoxins and vaccines against diphtheria, tetanus, anthrax, you name it. That's whenever things really started to blow up and kind of brought us into the modern time.
Right. Of course, that's, we're of a similar generation, but those are the Oregon Trail diseases, you know. Yeah. You're able to develop the vaccine then. An interesting bit of trivia just observed as was looking over the show notes, but the word vaccine is derived from the Latin word for cow, which is vacca. So the cowpox connection in mind, that's what Jenner called it, vaccination. So there's some more of that trivia.
Absolutely.
And another thing, Chris, I thought was really interesting with Jenner and then other folks pioneering vaccine like Pasteur is that this early vaccination time, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the germ theory of disease, that wasn't widely accepted by the scientific community then, right? So it wasn't even, vaccines were working, but it wasn't totally understood how they worked. Is that right?
Yeah, to be honest, I'm not 100% sure the timeline of the germ theory. I haven't really looked into that one recently. But it was during a time when there was a lot more medical skepticism. I mean, back in those days, a lot of the medical treatments you had were kind of counterintuitive, sometimes counterproductive. That's when you had like bleeding and a lot more like leech therapy and stuff. So there was more of a leeriness to the medical community. So the general acceptance of this is kind of a testament to how well it worked in practice.
Yeah, just going from, I would imagine too how much engineering it took then to go from, just these like these primitive inoculations to more widespread public inoculations. Just the development in that time, it's pretty amazing. Mm-hmm. Well, that's a perfect lead in to my next question was, let's talk about the development of vaccines. So we know that they aren't made overnight. We're hearing a lot about that now. Can you tell us in mostly layman terms, how exactly does a vaccine work? And are they all the same? Are there any great differences between?
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, we know they're not made overnight. It takes quite some time. And that's going to be something that we'll touch on probably in a couple, upcoming in the episode as we talk more about like the COVID vaccine. But so for the listeners, I want to kind of lay the foundation as to how vaccines work. And this kind of requires a little bit of an understanding of immunology, but we're going to keep it rather brief and a little more breezy. So for this discussion, we'll be talking about pathogens and antigens. Okay. So pathogens are the actual infectious organisms. So think like bacteria and viruses. And pathogens are then covered in these little molecules called antigens. And these antigens can essentially differ from pathogen to pathogen. Probably what a lot of people are aware of right now is the spike protein on the COVID or on the coronavirus. That you can think of the spike protein as the antigen. So these antigens are responsible basically for triggering our natural immune response. Now, of course, our immune system is very complex. It's a vastly huge system. But to simplify it, I want us to just sort of think of it as two big levels of defense. They're called the innate and the acquired immune system. The innate system is our body's preloaded software for handling infections. Kind of comes preloaded when you buy a computer off the shelf. All the stuff that comes preloaded on it, right? It's ready to fight infection immediately, but because of that, the trade-off is that it's not that strong. It's not really specific to any particular pathogen. So its main function is to just hold off the infection long enough for the second guys to come in, the acquired immune system. So the acquired immune system takes a little bit longer to develop because the two major cells of this system, the B cells and the T cells, they just simply take time to be produced. Notably, B cells are responsible for producing antibodies, a term that many of our listeners have been hearing quite a lot about lately, I'm sure, with all of the COVID vaccine talk. And what antibodies do is they contribute to immunity by neutralizing the pathogen. They can also stimulate their removal from the body, or they can latch on to the pathogen and trigger that pathogen for their destruction. So overall, the acquired immune system is responsible for targeting the specific pathogen with a stronger attack, but most importantly, for remembering that pathogen for the next time. So a good way to think about how vaccines come into play in this process. So a vaccine is basically like a pathogen imposter, okay? So it may look like a bacteria or virus, but it doesn't make the body actually sick. Essentially, the idea is to expose the body to the antigen, for example, like that spike protein from the coronavirus, in order to prime the immune response, so that those memory cells, so the B and T cells, can respond with speed and strength if the body ever encounters that pathogen again in the future. So I like to simplify things. I like to kind of come down to ways that we can remember this and conceptualize it. And one imperfect, but like a simple way I think about this is to think about the pathogen as being a bank robber. And the bank robber just so happens to be wearing a Baltimore Ravens jersey because, this is Steelers country, of course.
Sorry, not sorry to anybody listening from Baltimore. All right.
Exactly.
I follow.
Yeah. See, so you get it. So anyway, for this analogy to work, right? Just assume that no one else wears Baltimore Ravens jerseys, which they shouldn't in the first place. No, I'm just kidding. Your town learns that this bank robber is going from town to town, robbing all of the banks. And it's been taking a while. Every time the bank robber hits a town, it takes a while for the police to respond because they just don't know who they're looking for. So what you do is you take a mannequin wearing a Baltimore Ravens jersey to your local precinct, and you say, hey guys, keep on high alert for anything with this jersey on it, essentially. So basically that's how it works. You prime the defenses to recognize something specific. And vaccines all basically work the same in the fact that they do that priming of the immune system to a future exposure. But something key is that they differ in some viruses, or some vaccines can differ in the ways that they do that. Without going into huge specifics, some vaccines are made using a live virus, but they weaken that virus in such a way that it can't cause the actual disease. These vaccines typically produce some of the strongest immunity. So they basically bring the actual bank robber in, to continue the analogy, but he's handcuffed. Mm-hmm. So he can't cause the actual disease, but he produces a very robust response that way. Some other vaccines use the whole bacteria or virus, but it's been completely killed. So again, not able to cause any disease, but your immune system sees what it looks like, and is able to mount a response from the future, or in the future. And there's a newer growing class of vaccines that simply just use the antigen itself, or even smaller, even just a piece of that antigen to produce an immune response. So this would be sort of akin to showing the police just the full Ravens jersey, or even just the Ravens logo. So at this point, we're moving further and further away from using full cells to using just like key markers from those pathogens. And that's kind of your basic rundown of how they work.
And it's pretty incredible, the human immune system and the layers to it, but also just how we're able to manipulate nature this way to keep people safe is just incredible. Now, one thing I did want to ask, Chris, off the top of your head, you mentioned the live virus, or these other vaccines that function differently. Can you give any examples of like disease states that are treated with these different types of vaccines that you just mentioned?
Yeah, actually. So for example, probably your best live vaccine that's used very frequently is the measles, mumps, and rubella, as well as varicella, sometimes as varicella as well. I say that because everyone's fairly familiar with the MMR vaccine, getting that as children. The inactivated, the vaccines that are whole cell, but it is completely dead. The inactivated vaccines, probably the best example for that is the influenza vaccine, the yearly influenza vaccine. And then there's the newer class of vaccines, like I said, that where they're using just like a small piece of the antigen or even the antigen as a whole. And there's a few of those, but most notably to me is the pneumonia vaccines. So, for example, there's 2 pneumonia vaccines that adults receive or that they can receive, and one of them uses the entire outer coat of the bacteria. So it kind of like looks at the Ravens jersey. That's kind of the way that one works. And then the other one uses a piece of the pathogen, but kind of amps up the immune system by using some additional technology to ramp up like an extra strong defense. That would be more akin to using like the Ravens logo. So those are just some different vaccines that we commonly see, and how they differ based on that.
Right. Now, developing a vaccine, we already know how intense this process is and how long it is, but what are the very first steps that a research team would take to construct a vaccine?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and obviously it's a huge process. It takes, it's a huge research effort, as we're seeing right now with COVID. But most importantly, I think, is that the scientists simply need to identify the antigen. You need to know what you're trying to mimic. So the process of developing a vaccine is first identify the antigen, and then subsequently you need to make that antigen in the lab. So in some cases, this comes down to where the scientists will simply grow the virus or the bacteria as a way to produce the antigen. In other cases, this involves artificially creating the antigen. They can do this often using DNA from the pathogen itself and kind of use that as a template to produce the antigen in the lab. Regardless the method they use to grow or harvest the antigen, this antigen is then isolated and purified through a number of steps. That's a vast oversimplification. And in some cases, this purified antigen is then mixed with an additional agent called an adjuvant. And that was what I was getting to when I mentioned Prevnar, the one pneumonia vaccine. It's given with an adjuvant. And essentially, without going too deep, an adjuvant is just designed to provoke an even stronger immune response. So, for example, you can give the piece of the antigen, which typically doesn't typically produce that strong of an immune response, but when you put it with tetanus diphtheria toxoid, you can actually boost the immune response as well. And of course, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say just another layer. Just to make sure that it works and the intended effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Because sometimes if you were to give this one small piece, it wouldn't work well enough on its own. But they've determined that if you kind of give it a buddy, it can evoke a much larger immune response without giving as much of the actual pathogen. So it really, from 2 layers. One, it mitigates any possible risk of transmitting actual disease by giving the vaccine, which is helping to allay the public fear. But also from a manufacturing standpoint, you just don't have to physically grow as much antigen in the lab. So like if you think about it from a production standpoint, it makes it so much easier if you don't have to use as much product to evoke a response, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then, of course, for those vaccines that do use the whole pathogen, it's after this purification stage that the pathogens are then taken and they're either weakened or they're killed completely before bottling and further manufacturing.
Gotcha. So, Chris, we're early in the discussion, but I really think this is a perfect time to discuss what don't vaccines do. In other words, there's a lot of misinformation about vaccines. What are some of those major pieces of misinformation out there, and can you debunk those claims for us? I mean, even if we have listeners that know better or have heard all this before, I don't think this can be repeated enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good question to bring up in this kind of discussion because, like you said, unfortunately, there's a lot of misinformation surrounding vaccines. And I think that that's a result of the fact that information and misinformation is so readily available and disseminated now. A lot of the misinformation that's going around is often not properly vetted and not subject to what I would say the highest degree of scrutiny. So I think that first and foremost, I would like to highlight the World Health Organization here. And unfortunately, I don't know the exact title of the webpage, but they have something similar to a page where they debunk about 7, I would say, of the most commonly shared myths about vaccines. And I would really advise the listeners, if they're interested, to go and use that resource because I did find it very helpful. But really, there's probably more misinformation out there than time would allow for this podcast. I mean, that could be an entire episode in and of itself. So I would just like to highlight some of the big ones. So first and foremost is the idea that vaccines make people sick. I mean, I remember seeing and hearing this a lot back in my retail days when I was doing a lot more, physically giving a lot more vaccinations. People would say, "Oh, I would get that, but I would get that vaccine, but the last time I got it, I got sick after," and stuff like that. But what I think is most important to mention here is that, as we've mentioned before, albeit at more of a shallow level, vaccines that are made with killed pathogens or even just pieces of antigen, they just don't contain any viable living material. So they just couldn't physically cause the disease. I would say the one caveat are those live attenuated vaccines, such as the MMR that I mentioned before. Those do have a theoretical risk of causing disease. But because of the way they're manufactured in the lab, I mean, they're so thoroughly weakened in the lab that the odds of this occurring is extremely small. Not to mention, in order to make it to market, if they go through clinical trials, and if there had been any appreciable incidence of disease, that it would not have even made it to market.
Right.
But, just to make sure there is an extra level of caution that we do take, live vaccines are not given to people who have weakened immune systems. So these are patients who are undergoing chemo or are on other immunosuppressing medications, like a lot of the new biologics and stuff for like RA and psoriasis and stuff. And that's just an extra precaution, really. So the risk was low to begin with, but we take extra steps as well. Now, there are those who say that they got sick after a vaccine was given, so typically after the flu vaccine. So your common sentiment is, "Ooh, I got the flu vaccine, but then 2, 3, 4 days later, I got the flu anyway." And what people are often experiencing here is a short-lived ramping up of their immune system, meaning they didn't actually get the flu, because I do think that we have a lot of misperception of what the true flu really is, right? I know my family, I talk to them, and they always say, "Oh, I got the flu this year," and they actually didn't. Whereas this year, they actually truly did get the flu. And my mom's like, "Oh, I don't think I ever actually had the flu then before." So it puts things in perspective.
Right.
But in order for vaccines to work, they have to ramp up the immune system, and that comes with it, a little bit of immune effect, and it can cause someone to feel a little rough, but it's not a full-blown viral illness. It's also important to remember that how vaccines work. So they take a little bit of time to have a full effect. So if you or I were to get a vaccine today, but if we also contract that virus tomorrow or the day after, we're still going to get sick before the vaccine takes effect. So some of it does come down to just a bum luck kind of thing. But another big one, I'm sure you're and most of our listeners are aware of, is that vaccines cause autism, right? So this one's hampered us for decades now at this point. And unfortunately, this just came about from a flawed scientific journal article back in 1997. And it suggested that the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, was increasing autism rates. I can't state how important it is to understand that this article was then retracted from the journal, And even more than that, the physician who wrote it even lost his medical license. So that's saying something to the degree of severity that the medical community thought this information was putting out there, that they actually revoked his medical license. Since that time, so since 1997, there's not been any studies to show any link between any vaccine and the likelihood of developing autism. On top of this, there's actually been other studies identifying autism in children even before they received the MMR vaccine. But, with that said, I can see how people may associate the two. This was something that I heard on another podcast about vaccines too, is, you consider the age at which autism most commonly is diagnosed, and that just so happens to be around the same age where many children are starting to get their other childhood vaccines. So I can understand why concerned parents may want to associate the two just from a sheer timing standpoint. But again, I can't stress this enough. Just because two things are happening around the same time doesn't mean that one is necessarily causing the other.
Right. And one thing, of course, we as people aren't immune to are reasoning fallacies, and this is a classic post hoc reasoning fallacy.
Yeah, and when I totally agree with that. It's a great point. And when I say that, I don't want to discredit anyone. I always think that people should be educated consumers, but I think that they do need to kind of do the necessary research. And the way I always approach discussions with people, I say it's okay to have concerns about vaccines. You should always be concerned about things that you're putting in your body. It's just important to do the proper homework. That's all.
Absolutely.
But speaking about, concerns about what you're putting in your body, the last one that I wanted to touch on was the idea of toxins in vaccines. And this is pretty common as well. But the concern is typically regarding the use of either formaldehyde, mercury, or aluminum in vaccines. And just to put this as simply as I can, these chemicals can be toxic at certain levels, but not at the amounts that you find in vaccines. So one that I found most interesting was regarding formaldehyde, in the fact that there's about 50 times more formaldehyde in the average newborn baby than there is in a single dose of a vaccine. Plus, not to mention, it's also it's also a byproduct of normal metabolic processes. So it's something that our body already has in it on a day-to-day basis. You're not introducing appreciable amounts of it. And in fact, with regard to aluminum, there's also been studies where they measured aluminum levels, both pre and post vaccination, and there have not been any notable changes of aluminum levels in the bloodstream. So I think that one is one that's kind of been overstated as well.
Yeah, and I think too, you mentioned a word like formaldehyde. It's, to people who aren't educated, that's a scary word, that has negative connotations. So it's very easy to formaldehyde, without looking into what you mentioned, that there's 50 times more in an average baby than in the vaccine itself. So that's where education is so important. And
absolutely.
And like you said, definitely do your homework, but I think a lot of folks don't do the homework, and perhaps it's very easy for that disinformation to creep in because, again, they're not, the true information that's out there doesn't disseminate as easily.
Yeah, and just real quick, I wanted to mention something. This was something that I heard on another podcast that I was listening to about this topic, and they said probably the simplest, best thing I ever heard about vaccine knowledge or information is just, if you're doing your homework at home, always read the sources. So go to the bottom of the page and just look at the sources. So if the sources take you to just like one person's blog, that might not be the best option for information, as opposed to if you're reading something and the source is taking you to a large compendium of information or to a national organization or something, that would be a little bit more legitimate. So just do a thorough digging of the sources before you claim any information on that website XYZ is, gospel.
Right. And I think too, or rather, as you said, sources are important, you know, but look too for the organization that's putting it out, like
Hmm.
the National Institutes of Health, the CDC, the WHO, those, if there's associations there, that's going to be far more likely to be trusted, despite what some conspiracy theorists say. And we won't get into that because we could be here all afternoon with that. But
Absolutely.
absolutely do your homework and check the sources for sure. One quick thing I wanted to ask before we go to our first break here is that vaccines, when you talk vaccines, you can't talk about vaccines without talking about herd immunity. Give us a quick rundown of what is herd immunity and how does it relate to the efficacy of vaccines?
Yeah, absolutely. And another cool thing that I've been reading up on is the fact that a lot of people are using the terms community immunity as interchangeable with herd immunity. And I think that's just so that people have a better association as opposed to, feeling like one of a herd. This is more thought of as a community process. But essentially what it is herd immunity is the idea that if a certain percentage of the population were to be immune to a disease, typically through vaccination, then this would make it difficult for the disease to gain a foothold into the community. So it kind of creates an outer shield from the from any penetration to of the vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
And really, this is important because it offers protection to those people in the community that can't receive vaccines. So we don't start giving newborns vaccinations until they're a little bit older, typically around the age of 1, something like that. And some people, like I mentioned before, with compromised immune systems, they may not be able to receive certain vaccines. So for those people, this idea of herd or community immunity is really trying to insulate them from the outside pathogen. So the important thing to realize when you're talking about this concept is that this percentage can essentially change based on how infectious that pathogen is. So for example, a highly infectious pathogen like the measles requires a high vaccination rate of about 93%. And this is actually why we started to see that uptick in the outbreaks last year of measles, because even a very small dip in measles vaccination rates can lead to a quick uptick in measles cases. And to kind of bring it to more current topics, I try to do some digging, and interestingly, the current estimates regarding COVID-19 put the herd immunity threshold somewhere between 50 and 70%. I also saw some lower, around 50%. But essentially that means that once it's available, about 60 to 70% of the population will need vaccinated to prevent any sort of community spread from there. So I thought that's important for our listeners to know as well.
Absolutely. And with COVID-19, I'll also see things written where it'll talk about herd immunity through natural infection, which is another way that it can happen. But achieving it that way with something like COVID-19 well, in a word, that would be horrifying, as I understand it. That means a lot of people would likely die, and of course, just a lot of infections. A lot of people would have to get better, but of course, that means a lot of people would also pass on as well.
Absolutely.
So we want the vaccine for sure.
Yes.
We're going to take a little break now to tell you a little more about the Diamond Drug Information Center. On a personal level, we all appreciate when our pharmacist gives us a thorough consultation for a new or complex medication. They dispense not only the drug, but important information about dosing and possible interactions. This kind of medication counseling is easy to understand on a personal level, but what about on an institutional level? Where do healthcare providers, especially those delivering care to large populations with diverse needs, go when they need medication counseling? Enter the Diamond Drug Information Center. The pharmacists of the Drug Info Center dispense in-depth clinical consultation for all of Diamond's customers, from correctional facilities to nursing homes. This team of PharmDs specializes in pharmacotherapy and disease state management. And if you have questions about dosing, drug-drug interactions, non-formulary medication requests, therapeutic alternatives, or you just need general clinical advice, they're a call away. They also take proactive steps to educate healthcare professionals. They issue regular clinical updates, and they develop webinars and presentations about specific drug topics. You can reach the Diamond Drug Information Center at 800-882-6337, extension 1834, or email them druginfo@diamondpharmacy.com. And now back to PodcastRx.
We're back on PodcastRx. We're talking to Chris Bender about vaccines, vaccinations. So, Chris, as a drug info center pharmacist, I assume you're fielding a lot of questions from clients at correctional facilities, long-term care facilities about vaccines. I also know that you develop webinars, presentations, and spearhead other educational efforts. So, how often do vaccine issues come up in your day-to-day pharmacist role?
Wow, probably a nearly daily basis, I would say. So me and my colleagues, we in the Drug Information Center, we typically wear a lot of hats. So these kind of discussions kind of happen from all aspects. So I know personally, I'm often making general vaccination recommendations for patients who are in chronic care clinics whenever I speak with providers. But we also tend to get a lot of interesting questions about vaccines. So we often get questions like, can these vaccines be given at the same time? How long can a particular vaccine still be used if it were left out of the refrigerator? Or even oddball stuff like, is this particular vaccine safe to use in a patient with a latex allergy? So we kind of get everything from how do you apply the guidelines clinically to more of the logistical questions of like stability and administration and stuff like that. So we really kind of get questions from all angles, which is nice.
Yeah. For the record, and maybe there's a broader ballpark answer for this, but how long can a vaccine be left out?
I would say it's very dependent on the vaccine. So what we do typically in our day-to-day job is we will get the question from a facility if it's been left out for like a day or something at room temperature. And then we have to contact the manufacturer and they give us a specific answer, because as they tell us, and as we always, recommend to others, is you can't necessarily be confident when you're doing something off label. And most of the times they don't give you a lot of leeway if it's being left out, because they're so sensitive. These products, they're developed biologically, so they are often very fragile. So a lot of them, unfortunately, they don't have a very long shelf life.
I wouldn't think
they're at room temperature.
Okay. And you mentioned a latex allergy. I didn't know this. How do latex allergies affect a vaccine?
Yeah, that's actually pretty interesting. So from like a manufacturing standpoint, you have two ways that vaccines are stored and manufactured. So sometimes they come in vials, sometimes they come in pre-filled syringes. And depending on the type of vaccine, some of the vaccine vials may have the little rubber part at the top where you have to impale with the syringe to get into the vial. Sometimes that can be made out of latex.
Okay.
As well as in the syringes, the little rubber stopper, the plunger that you would press to inject the vaccine, sometimes that can be made out of latex as well. So,
I see.
Since coming into a place like Diamond where we have such a large patient population, I've really come to realize or come to appreciate that the prevalence of latex allergies is a lot more than I originally thought. So we kind of feel those every once in a while.
Yeah. Well, of course, that patient population, whether it's corrections or long-term care, these are vulnerable populations. So with corrections, what are some of the common vaccines and vaccine-related disease states that you're seeing in this particular setting in corrections?
Well, obviously, with all of our patient populations, we typically see a lot of our routine things like influenza vaccination. But aside from those routine vaccines, corrections is a pretty unique environment, actually, because just by nature of being incarcerated, a patient becomes a candidate for hepatitis A and B vaccinations based on the national guidelines. These vaccines are then also sort of doubly indicated if an incarcerated patient has hepatitis C, which, of course, with our correctional populations, we see a fair bit of hepatitis C co-infection. Aside from the hepatitis vaccines, we do also see a lot of tetanus boosters, and this is typically from patients coming in from the outside with either like cuts and lacerations or dirty wounds whenever they present to the facility. So I'd say those are probably the more commonly used uncommon vaccines, if you want to call it that, beyond your
Yeah.
routine vaccines.
One thing I did want to ask, Chris, is why is hepatitis such a prevalent disease in corrections settings? I mean, this underscores what you do as a sort of specialty pharmacist. Why hepatitis?
Well, hepatitis C, unfortunately, is very transmissible by risky behaviors, to put it simply. So it can be transmissible by IV drug use, as well as through sexual practices. So unfortunately, these are some of the more co-occurring things that we see in the correctional population. So these are patients who are engaging in some riskier, some of our correctional patients engage in riskier behavior, so they're presenting in the correctional facilities, perhaps with an active hepatitis C status. And by nature of having hepatitis C, it's recommended to give a patient hepatitis A and hepatitis B vaccination, simply because at least we can prevent hepatitis A and hepatitis B, whereas you cannot prevent hepatitis C because we don't yet have a vaccine, unfortunately. But it's one of those things where we want to mitigate any possible extra damage that could happen by a patient, say, acquiring hepatitis A infection on top of a hepatitis C infection, if that makes sense.
Yeah, understood. Switching to long-term care, what are the more common vaccines you're dealing with there?
Yeah, so in long-term care, you tend to have an older population. And with that comes its own vaccination schedule, own recommendations. Of course, we can see that in the correctional facility too, but we typically see it more clustered in the long-term care setting. So most commonly beside influenza, of course, we typically see pneumococcal or the pneumonia vaccines, because we typically start to recommend those vaccines, with some exception, starting in patients over the age of 65. And then probably the other next most commonly used one would be the shingles vaccine, which the newer shingles vaccine, Shingrix, is actually indicated for those patients 50 and older now. So that's a lot of the same age range that we have in long-term care, be it the 60s and above. So those are the ones that we see a lot more commonly in those patients. When
you're working with these patients, these environments, do you or any of the providers you work with, do you ever encounter any hangups or objections from patients over vaccines? I mean, we hear about this in the community, of course, but are there any challenges specific to these environments relative to these vaccines that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I think that's a good point that you just made there, because obviously they're just the same people in a facility as there are in the outside, quote unquote free world, or however you want to refer to it. So you're always going to have those same implicit biases from some of the population that we've already just talked about. So just a disclaimer. So while I work with both nursing home and corrections, I do typically work more closely with the corrections side. So that way where my perspective is coming from. What I tend to see in general is an overall acceptance of vaccination. In corrections, unfortunately, we sometimes get patients who haven't had a lot of exposure to the healthcare system, and because of that, they can be pretty behind on their vaccines. What I will say that it warms my heart is that from my experience with these patients, they do seem to be more appreciative than not to be receiving this updated health maintenance, because like I said, they don't have that exposure to the healthcare system. This is an opportunity for them to come in and kind of get up to speed somewhat. So I've noticed that it's pretty well accepted. There are, of course, some instances where patients refuse vaccines. I'm typically not made aware of the reason why from our perspective. So I'm left to just imagine that in some cases, patients may simply not want to be poked and prodded right after they've been recently admitted to a correctional facility. But again, that's just my own take on things. It's a stressful time for them, so that might not be the first thing that they want to do per se.
Right. That makes sense, thinking about it that way. Now, how do vaccines in the corrections environment, since you're most familiar with that, how do you feel they contribute to public health overall?
I think that's an awesome question, and mainly because it's often one aspect of public health that gets overlooked, because people don't always think of correctional facilities as being part of the community. So I think it's easy for some to question the need for any investment in vaccines for people who may not be either staying at the facility for a long time, or for those people who may not be returning to the general public for quite some time. It's kind of easy to say, well, why do we need to spend money if they're not going to come back home for a long time? Well, with that said, I think it's important to highlight 3 key points here. The first of which is that you already said it before. Incarcerated patients are a vulnerable population, so they're often at a higher risk of vaccine preventable disease, whether it be because they come from a lower socioeconomic status, whether they have a history of alcohol or illicit drug use, or from risky sexual behavior. This results in the second point, that by this population coming and going from the correctional facility, then the correctional facilities sort of become a hub of potential disease transmission. And finally, the third point is that when it comes to jails specifically, the average stay is only 2 weeks.
Right.
So that means this potentially vulnerable person is going in, becoming exposed by nature of being in this central hub, and then they inevitably go back into the community, and this can perpetuate community spread. So that's why it's essential from like a comprehensive public health perspective that we continue to remember that jails and prisons are part of the community just as much as nursing homes and rehabilitation centers. And by increasing your vaccination rates there, by capturing more patients there, you're actually preventing more disease from going out into the facility or out into the community.
Yeah, for sure. And given that America has the highest incarceration rate in the developed world, in some ways, jails and prisons are de facto nursing homes and rehab centers. So, like you said, a sound vaccination policy makes a lot of sense from a public health perspective. Yeah. All right, let's take another quick break here, and we'll be right back with Chris Bender.
We're going to take a quick break from this dialogue to bring you more dialogue. In this case, dialogue, DIALOG, stands for the Diamond Information and Learning Opportunities Group. It's Diamond's in-house speaker and continuing education bureau. If you have a group or facility with continuing ed needs, Dialogue can help set up an in-service for you. Our expert speakers and educators include pharmacists specializing in gerontology, anticoagulation therapy, and HIV, and we also have certified registered nurse practitioners and educators who specialize in disease states and well-being, and also numerous professional staff with expertise in everything from human resources management to safety and disaster preparedness. Dialogue also offers an LPN IV certification program for licensed practical nurses in Pennsylvania. This 8-hour course is approved by the PA State Board of Nursing to satisfy the mandated regulation to allow an LPN to manage and initiate IV therapy. This class is only open to facilities, organizations, and groups of 5 or more. For more information on courses and continuing education opportunities, please contact Trina Plazio at 800-882-6337, extension 1100. You can also visit diamondpharmacyltc.com/learn/dialogue. And now, back to PodcastRx.
We're back on PodcastRx talking vaccines with Chris Bender from our Drug Information Center. Now, Chris, before we conclude our discussion, we would absolutely be remiss if we didn't discuss in a little detail the development of a COVID-19 vaccine. Really, the world is holding its collective breath over this. As of this writing, there's a lot of mentions of the different organizations, entities that are working to develop a vaccine. We have the Operation Warp Speed initiative happening here in the U.S., partnerships between different public and private entities, hear about Oxford University. Can you shed some light into how the COVID-19 vaccine development is coming along? And in your professional estimation, how far do you think we are from seeing a widely available and effective vaccine?
Yeah, absolutely. I think really there are very few things more pertinent to this discussion than what we are currently seeing with the vaccine development surrounding this coronavirus. I mean, I think we just really need to take a moment to appreciate the work that's being done here. So given the fact that it typically takes 5, 6, 10 years in some cases to develop a vaccine, yet here we are a mere, 5 months after the after the WHO declared this as a pandemic, with more than 165 vaccines in development, 28 vaccines currently in human trials. And of those 28 vaccines, I just wanted to double check today, there are now currently 8 vaccines in phase 3 trials.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's very promising, especially in this, like I said, in this short time frame. And why I specifically mentioned the phase 3 trials as something important. Phase 3 trials are large scale efficacy studies, and they're basically the final step in the development process. Of course, of these 8, the most promising of these include the Oxford vaccine, as you mentioned, but also others from Moderna and Pfizer. And what I consider to be an interesting development to come from this vaccine process, just beyond how quickly it's gone, is the advent of a new type of vaccine. So I mentioned before, vaccines come in all shapes and sizes, many different manufacturing process, many different ways in which they work. But the new vaccine type that we're seeing come out of this process is the mRNA vaccine. So just to summarize it a bit, mRNA is a messenger, basically, that a cell can use to assemble a certain protein. So you can think of mRNA, which is messenger RNA, like one of those printed pamphlets from IKEA, right? Basically tells you how to create this specific piece of furniture. Now, the only difference here is that you have to use all of your own wood from your own house. You have to make the whole piece of furniture from your own internal materials. But it's the same idea. So it's a schematic, right? So essentially, when you give it via a vaccine, the mRNA enters the body and then triggers the body to produce that antigen, which in this case is the spike protein from the surface of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. In this, by doing it this way, there's no risk of infection, as with the other vaccines that we mentioned, because there's no active virus being given to the patient. Just simply the instruction set on how to make this spike protein.
Okay.
So of those previously mentioned candidates, of those 3 main candidates, Moderna and Pfizer are using this technology, while Oxford is still using the more traditional approach. Just thought that interesting to note. Of course, what I've been seeing is, and of course it's hard at the time of this podcast being produced, it'll probably already be somewhat outdated, as with all COVID podcasts have been,
Sure.
But all 3 have demonstrated the ability to generate an immune response, which has been evidenced by increases in antibodies against COVID-19, levels much higher, in fact, than those being generated by natural infection with actual COVID-19, which is very promising. But remember, a key function of an effective immune system is that memory function. We want to be able to remember that pathogen for the next time. And that function is carried out by T cells. Fortunately, we're also seeing reports of T cell production following vaccination. So I do think that bodes well for at least some degree of long-term immunity. I think that the jury is still out in terms of how long the immunity will last. But I do think that having that positive T cell responses is very positive news. So while it's hard to nail down the specifics on these vaccine candidates, it does appear that at least some will require a 2-dose series to provide adequate immunity. And like I said, it's even harder to tell moving forward how long this immunity is going to last. I've already heard reports of maybe this being an annual vaccine like influenza, but who knows if it might, the ideal would be a one and done type of thing, but I think that's yet to be seen. Now, with regard to the other part of your question regarding the availability, this is so hard to speculate. And really it's for many different reasons. So it appears that most candidates are eyeing a 2021 timeframe, presumably the spring of 2021. Obviously, we're hopeful for something sooner or as soon as possible. What I did find interesting though was and just a quick plug, the New York Times has a very good COVID-19 vaccine tracker. If you just Google NY Times COVID tracker, it's where I got a lot of the information as to how many are in phase 3 trials, et cetera. I think it's just nice that one place is putting everything in one location. And what I did see on there is that the Oxford vaccine may be able to deliver emergency vaccines by October, which is a little ludicrous to think about because that's right around the corner.
Absolutely,
But I don't know how many that's going to be. I don't know what emergency vaccines constitutes in terms of number and volume.
Right.
Like I said, it seems like a bold deadline. But what I will say is that if there are doses available by the end of the year, these are likely going to be given to the first line or the frontline healthcare workers, obviously, to help mitigate the spread, to keep them healthy, to keep the healthcare system working. As for the general population, as with every other podcast I've listened to about this, it's like I'd rather not speculate just because so many things can happen and so many things are factors. Like, you have to even consider one of the things that people have mentioned is the manufacturing process, like physically bottling the vaccine. Has already been reported as a potential bottleneck. We may be producing this large volume of fluid, but the process by which you put that fluid into vials having to be so sterile, that might be a bottleneck in and of itself. And for no fault of the vaccine's own, it may be delayed until the fall of 2021 just because of the bottling process. So unfortunately, I think only time will tell, but I do think 2021 will be at least a more reasonable time frame.
Right. And that's totally fair not to speculate. And from things that I've read, even if it is developed and you have the news outlets, politicians, and whomever, kind of heralding the arrival, I mean, we still have a long way to go with implementation. One Washington Post article that I was reading noted that, you're refining the vaccine to its full potential. That process could take years. The first version of a vaccine might not necessarily be the best. One expert that was quoted in the article used HIV as an example, in noting that in the early days of that pandemic, that the drugs weren't what they are now. So as he said, the first COVID vaccines could indeed be mediocre, but only time will tell.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because you see that even with I don't want to say normal, but with other more common vaccines. We had a shingles vaccine for years that worked, but it waned over time and it didn't have like this huge immunity. Maybe like 50 to 70% of people were then immune to shingles. And then you have Shingrix come out, years later, and it's way more robust. It has way longer duration of immunity. So that's why I think just me personally, I do feel like this initial, like you said, is going to be more of maybe an annual type of thing. It's going to wane quickly, but then years down the road, we're going to get that one and done vaccine created then.
Yeah, here's hoping. Now, to get away from the COVID doom and gloom for a second, and to just end the discussion, let's end it on a lighter note. So, as I've noted at the top of the show, you're one of our favorite pharmacy nerds on here. That we love having you as a guest. So, I would like to know if you have an all-time favorite vaccine, and if so, tell us why it's your favorite.
I think that's a really cool question to end on. So I think obviously the best vaccine of all time has to be the smallpox vaccine, right? I mean, and that one's almost unfair. I mean, the world was able to eradicate an entire disease through a concerted vaccination effort. We can't say that about any other disease. I mean, polio is close behind, so that one's really cool too. So of course that one's tough to beat. But when I was thinking of one of the coolest vaccines, one of the most unique vaccines, I think one of the coolest vaccines out there right now is called Provenge. So typically, and this is not common, many people may not know about it right now, because typically we think about using vaccines for disease prevention, right? But Provenge is actually a treatment. In this case, a treatment for pancreatic cancer. So under normal conditions, cancer is able to replicate throughout the body freely. And this is just because there's nothing about those cells that kind of alerts the body to destroy them. They're just your cells, right? Well, in a nutshell, Provenge is individually manufactured on a case-by-case basis. And it's done based on a patient's own activated immune cells. So essentially, a patient has some blood drawn, or a patient with, prostate cancer has blood drawn, and then their immune cells will be removed. And then through a detailed process, these cells are then sensitized to prostate cancer cells in a lab. And then these cells, once they've been activated, are then infused back into the patient, where they then start signaling all sorts of immune cells to attack the prostate cancer cells. So it essentially wakes your body's immune system up to the fact that there's cancer spreading in the body. Yeah. And
that's incredible.
And that's what I think is so interesting about it, is that while it's not your typical vaccine, I think it's a great example of how there are not only different vaccines, but basically science is finding ways to kind of hack the immune system. And I really think it sort of spells a nice future for the area of vaccines and immunology as a whole, and just kind of showing where science is going. So that would probably be my favorite at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. Is Provenge a widely available treatment?
Not that I'm aware of. And that's just simply because it's it's manufactured on a case-by-case basis. So it's not like anyone can just write, not every prescriber can write for it. I believe you even have to be part of like a registry type of thing. And I want to say that it's because it's newer, it's not a broad class of agents. So it probably has a lot of restriction, but they also probably want to continue studying it aftermarket. So it's a more highly monitored type of thing.
Right. Understood.
But for a disease like cancer, I mean, that's just pretty cool that they can use that. So. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, the entire field, the entire study, immunology vaccines is so interesting. And again, we could make 5, 6, 10 podcasts about this, but we're just going to settle for this one for now. So Chris, thank you again so much for joining us, sharing your expertise. We really appreciate it and love the conversation. Let's do it again sometime.
Yeah, absolutely. You know where to find me. I'm always willing and able to hop back in the chair with you guys. I really appreciate being here today.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Our pleasure. Chris Bender from the Diamond Drug Information Center. And thanks again, everyone, for listening to PodcastRx.
This podcast features conversations with healthcare professionals. Their statements and opinions discussed herein are for informational purposes only. This podcast should not be considered professional medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for the advice of an appropriately qualified and licensed healthcare professional. Therefore, listeners must not rely on the statements made herein.
PodcastRx is a production of Diamond Pharmacy Services, the nation's largest correctional pharmacy provider. Catch our new episodes on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Please rate the show and leave us a review. And if you have a topic you'd like to hear about on the show, or you'd like to share your thoughts on an episode, you can email us at podcastrx@diamondpharmacy.com.
Music in this episode by Wolfgang Worley. Sound expressed by Getty Images. Additional music by the 126ers and Silent Partner.